You may have noticed in the previous episode that the title character never showed up for even a single second. However, in this episode, Boba Fett does actually make a small guest appearance for about a minute, though he doesn't actually say anything and he just stands in one spot and nods a couple of times. The main character of this series is in every way a failure. So of course the show creators need to fall back to the old standard, which is a trend throughout this entire series, and the same thing happened through both seasons of The Mandalorian. The show creators only have one thing left. It's not clever dialogue, it's not interesting planets and locations, and it's definitely not exciting fight scenes. Instead, the only thing left they have in this series is nostalgia bait. It's the only trick in the bag. And this episode is about as shallow as you can possibly get. There is almost nothing of any significance that actually happens. More than half of the entire runtime exists solely as filler to stretch the episode. However, from start to finish, it is packed with nostalgia bait. The writers are hoping to distract you with shiny things so that you won't notice that the episode itself lacks any real substance. Unfortunately, this episode also locks in the character destruction of Luke Skywalker, something that a lot of viewers probably didn't even realize was happening as they were watching it, but I'll cover that a little bit later. The Book of Boba Fett is bad, Episode 6. We open with the Marshal confronting some Pikes doing a trade deal out in the middle of nowhere. Right away, something seems very odd to me. Two of the Pikes were delivering spice and the other two were buying it with credits, but I have to ask, why were these four Pikes in a single speeder, and why did they take it out into the middle of the desert in order to make the trade? If they were all traveling together, it seems somewhat unnecessary to go to a remote location instead of just exchanging it wherever they happened to meet up originally. Regardless, Marshall confronts them and says that they will not be allowed to sell spice through his territory. Now, some people that have watched my videos think that I only want to say bad things, but that's not true. I make every attempt to point out the good and the bad, but the problem is that most of the time there's very little good to point out. So in this case, I need to play devil's advocate and actually defend the show creators in regard to the spice. Obviously, there have been a lot of comparison to Frank Herbert's Dune, where a substance known as spice is collected on a desert planet, and this does kind of look like that. And while there are similarities, this is not the blatant copying like some of the things we saw in the previous episode. First of all, the spice is not collected on Tatooine, but rather it's being brought here. It's taken from the spice mines on Kessel. This, too, is not something that the show creators made up themselves. Some of the earliest lines in the early Star Wars movies included C-3PO suggesting sent to the spice mines on Kessel.
Sent to the spice mines of Kessel.
And of course, at that time, no one really knew what the spice was, and it was likely intended to just be a throwaway line. However, spice was expanded upon in the extended universe and actually became a real thing. I think the problem with the show creators using spice is that they're doing it on Tatooine, which of course is going to draw those unnecessary comparisons to Frank Herbert's Dune. If they had used spice on nearly any other planet, then it probably would have been received better. I also want to point out that this scene does a pretty decent job of setting up a new villain at the end of the episode, and that's because one of the Pike aliens decides to draw his blaster, but the Marshal is able to quickly take out 3 of the Pikes very easily. He lets the 4th remaining Pike take all the credits and leave on the speeder, but he insists that the spice be left behind. The Marshal then kicks over the box, allowing all the spice to be carried away on the wind. Credit where it's due, this is a pretty solid opening. Unfortunately, it's about to get a lot worse, and a lot more boring.
You make me sad.
Mando arrives at a planet where Luke Skywalker has been training Goku to be a Jedi. He's met with R2-D2, who takes him on an incredibly slow tour through the forest, where we see other droids constructing a stone building that will one day become Luke Skywalker's Jedi Training Academy. When they get close to the building, R2-D2 shuts himself off, and Mando decides to take a nap on a nearby bench. Now let me ask you, how much time do you think all of that took? Maybe 30 or 40 seconds? How about 4 minutes? It took 4 minutes for Mando to land his ship, slowly walk through the forest, and then take a nap on the bench. We had 4 minutes of basically nothing. But don't worry, it gets worse. It then moves over to Luke and Goku, who are meditating, but Goku gets distracted by a frog. Luke prevents him from eating it and uses his force powers to lift about a dozen frogs out of the pond. We are now at the 12-minute mark of this episode. We had to sit and watch Goku and Luke sit around and meditate and lift a couple frogs in the air for 3 minutes, which means that the previous 7 minutes of this episode had absolutely no substance whatsoever. It was Mando walking through a forest and then taking a nap on a bench, and then Luke lifting some frogs into the air. That was 7 minutes worth of content. There are going to be those that will clap their hands and bark like seals because they got to see Luke and Goku on the screen. And of course, that is exactly the reaction that Disney is going for. They don't want you to realize that there is no substance. They don't want you to realize just how empty and shallow and hollow this show truly is. They will wave shiny objects attempting to trick you into believing that there's something more than wishful nostalgia, but there isn't.
And there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it.
And the nostalgia train keeps going, because then Luke uses the Force to try to unlock some of Goku's memories, and what we see is when Palpatine gave Order 66 to wipe out the Jedi, because once again, nostalgia is the only trick in the bag.
You don't approve. Well, too bad.
The memory itself shows several other Jedi being taken out, but it fades away before the clone troopers are able to make it all the way to Goku. Then we move over to Mando, who finally wakes up from his little nappy time. Seems like he's been taking lessons from Boba Fett on that one. And he's met with none other than the arrival of Ahsoka, because again, nostalgia is the only trick in the bag. Mando says that he wants to give his gift to Goku, and also ensure that Goku is safe. Then, in a hilarious line of dialogue from Ahsoka, she assures him that Goku being alongside Luke Skywalker is the safest place in the galaxy. You know, unless Luke has a bad dream and decides to kill him in his sleep. Mando says that Goku is a foundling of the Mandalorians, but Ahsoka believes that he's now a Padawan of the Jedi, and for some stupid reason, Mando doesn't bring up the possibility of Goku being both. After all, Mando has the Darksaber, which was created by a Mandalorian who became a Jedi.
Danny kind of forgot it.
Hey, Mando. Hey, you know how you're having trouble using the Darksaber? And now you're here with not just one, but 2 Force users who use that exact type of weapon? Don't you think that it might be a good idea to ask Ahsoka how she uses her lightsabers? Maybe she could give you some tips or some small amount of training in order to use the Darksaber? Don't you think that might be a good idea, since there is very few, maybe only a handful of people in the entire galaxy that uses that kind of weapon? Don't you think it might be a good idea to ask them about it? Huh? Hey, Mando. Hey. Why are you so dumb?
I am insulted on your behalf.
But of course, Mando doesn't ask any of these things because he's an idiot and the writers are terrible. Ahsoka then convinces Mando not to speak to Goku because it would ruin his training or something. So instead, Mando just leaves the gift with her and then leaves the planet altogether. Luke is trying to teach Goku how to use a force jump, but he's struggling with it, so Luke puts him in a backpack and then runs through the forest exactly like he did for his own training with Yoda. He even does a front-flipping jump, exactly like what he did when he was training with Yoda, because nostalgia is the only trick in the bag. Luke uses a training droid to shoot blasters at Goku in order to help him practice with the Force jump, but eventually Goku gets sick of it and uses the Force to destroy the little droid and drops it into the river. Ahsoka comes over and gives Mando's gift to Luke, and also says some of the cringiest dialogue possible. She says that Luke is so much like his father, because nostalgia is the only trick in the bag. Continuing, Mando arrives at Tatooine again, and this is where we have a very brief cameo guest appearance by none other than Boba Fett. But don't get too excited though, he's only on screen for about 30 seconds and he has no lines of dialogue. Instead, Fennec explains that the Pike aliens are bringing in more forces and they need to get some more as well, and Mando says that he might know a few people. And then that's it for the scene, and we don't see Boba Fett again, because essentially he's been reduced to a guest starring cameo role in his own series. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, it's funny, is it?
Mando travels over to the town in the desert with the Marshal and tries to convince him and the people there to join the fight. When the Marshal comes out, he looks at Mando's ship and says, quote, "Is that a Naboo starfighter?" And honestly, at this point, he could have just said, "Hey, is that a bunch of nostalgia bait?" Because really, it would have served the same purpose. Anyways, the Marshal and the townspeople don't want anything to do with it, but Mando suggests that if the Pike aren't stopped now, then eventually they'll gain control of the entire planet, and that would be bad for everyone. Mando gets into his ship and leaves, but shortly after, a stranger appears walking in the desert, and it turns out to be the bounty hunter named Cad Bane, also known as more nostalgia bait, because how many times do I have to say this? It's the only trick in the bag. Eventually, Bane arrives at the town, and he makes an offer for the Marshal. Rather than siding with Boba Fett, the Pikes will pay the Marshal and the townspeople to simply stay home and not fight. But the Marshal makes it clear that he doesn't want the Pikes running spice through the area. This results in a standoff between the Marshal and Bane, as well as a deputy that's standing nearby. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that the show was trying to set up a villain at the end. We saw the Marshal effortlessly deal with several Pike, showing that the Marshal is a very skilled fighter. However, in this duel, Bane is able to take out not only the Marshal, but also the deputy with ease, showing that he is indeed a very large threat, showing that he's even faster than the Marshal. It should be noted that while the deputy is almost certainly dead, it does appear that the Marshal will likely survive. Not only was he hit in the shoulder, but we see some of the townspeople rendering aid to him as the scene cuts away. The loss of the deputy, combined with the injury to the Marshal, will likely cause the townspeople to rally around the Marshal when he goes to aid Mando and Boba Fett in their fight against the Pikes. We then see a few Pike entering the cantina with a large container that would normally store credits. They sit down for a few minutes, but then they leave without the container, which explodes, destroying the cantina. Back with Luke, he insists that Goku must abandon his attachments in order to pursue the life of a Jedi. Luke offers him two things: a small chainmail shirt, which was the gift from Mando, or a small lightsaber, which once belonged to Yoda. But Luke says that Goku cannot walk both paths and must choose either Mandalorian or the Jedi, which I have to remind you sounds incredibly stupid, because the guy that created the Darksaber was actually both.
What good are you? Do you have a brain?
And while it's certainly true that the Jedi Order taught their students to separate from attachments prior to the Empire, it absolutely is not something that Luke Skywalker believed in. He believed that his connections to his friends and his family made him stronger, but for some idiotic reason, the show creators are ignoring that. Luke Skywalker very firmly believed in the value of his attachments. That's why he was willing to travel to Cloud City on Bespin in order to try to rescue his friends. Knowing that it would be dangerous, knowing that it was a trap specifically set for him, he went anyways, because he valued his friends and he knew that they were a strength to him.
That is why your friends are made to suffer.
That's why I have to go.
Later in Return of the Jedi, the Emperor even taunted Luke with this information, suggesting that his faith in his friends was his weakness.
Your faith in your friends is yours.
But Luke knew the truth, that his friends, his attachments, his love for family were actually a strength, and he used that bond and that love for his family to not only pull himself away from the dark side, but also to free his father from the dark side.
Never. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Because the fact of the matter is, it wasn't love or attachments that drove Anakin to the dark side. It was fear for the loss of Padme, and fear that they might be discovered because he had to constantly keep their relationship a secret. That is what drove Anakin to the dark side. What ultimately brought him back into the light was love, and the attachments he had to his children, to both Luke and Leia. That is what brought Anakin back into the light. It was love, and it was attachments. There is absolutely no possible way that Luke Skywalker would now just suddenly turn around and say, "You're not allowed to have any attachments." That is not Luke Skywalker.
That's impossible!
But unfortunately, the character that we saw in the sequel trilogy and what we're seeing in this series is not actually Luke Skywalker. It's Disney Luke Skywalker. And there is a big distinction between those two characters. Because this one, this version, this pathetic facsimile, this copy, this pretender, remember, he tried to kill his own nephew over a bad dream. This is a worthless loser who will sit on an island drinking green milk. Because remember, even if for some reason you happen to like this series, never forget that it will always lead to green milk.
Oh, I don't know. You managed to destroy just about everything today. The villains, the heroes.
However, this episode ends with a cliffhanger, and we don't know what Goku is going to choose. If I had to guess, I think perhaps Goku might take the lesson of lifting the frogs earlier and choose to lift both the chainmail and the lightsaber at the same time. This would prove that not only has he been learning, but he chose to embrace multiple aspects of his life rather than just one. But that might be giving the talent of the writers a little too much credit, and we're probably just gonna end up with Goku picking the chainmail so he can go back to Mando, which means that he can be included in more episodes of The Mandalorian, and then Disney can sell more toys. Regardless, the entire episode was really nothing more than dragged out empty nostalgia bait, because, as I keep saying, that is the only trick in the bag. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 6.